The region encompassing what would become the Croatian heartlands, known as the Roman provinces of Dalmatia and Pannonia, was strategically vital and heavily militarized within the broader administrative structure of Illyricum. This territory functioned as the primary reservoir for manpower, supplying the empire's mobile field armies, especially following the military reorganizations of the Tetrarchy. Governance was highly centralized, articulated through a sophisticated system of self-administering urban centers, known as municipia or civitates, which were responsible for the fiscal and legal management of their surrounding rural territories. Provincial authority ultimately derived from the Praetorian Prefecture of Illyricum, tasked with overseeing the volatile Western Balkan frontier. The economic stability and funding of the entire defensive apparatus relied upon the rigorous collection of synchronized land and poll taxes known as capitatio and iugatio, resources that sustained both the permanent frontier legions and the complex bureaucratic machinery centered far away in Ravenna. The monumental construction projects undertaken in the region signify its imperial importance. The vast fortified residence constructed by Emperor Diocletian in the early 4th century near Salona, an unparalleled example of late antique architecture, illustrates this perfectly. This sprawling complex was not merely a retreat for the retired Augustus, but a carefully engineered military garrison and administrative hub designed to ensure the emperor's security while maintaining proximity to key supply lines, the unpredictable Balkan military zone. Its distinctive symmetrical design, borrowing equally from military castra and palatial residential forms, served as a template for urban adaptation and survival as the wider civil administration began its protracted decline. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The authority of the Roman state did not dissolve overnight, but weakened through a sustained process of external accommodation and internal decay. The significant settlement of various Gothic groups across the Balkans during the 5th century critically undermined the traditional Roman defensive philosophy. These groups moved beyond simple raiding to negotiate for formalized lands and subsidies, transforming into foederati who wielded tangible military authority independent of the provincial governor's mandate. This era instigated the degradation of the once efficient imperial road network and accelerated the abandonment of vulnerable large rural estates, compelling surviving Romanized populations to concentrate their resources within smaller, defensible coastal strongholds. Following the symbolic final collapse of the Western Empire in 476 AD, centralized imperial authority in the region fragmented into a mosaic of localized power bases. Effective civil governance, once the responsibility of the provincial governor and his staff, largely ceased to operate in the mountainous interior. This left a scattering of Byzantine-aligned coastal cities, such as Zadar and Split, maintaining tenuous administrative and ecclesiastical ties to Constantinople. The vast, ungoverned interior, lacking functional infrastructure and administrative oversight, became known simply as the hinterland. The intricate legal framework was reduced to simplified Roman legal principles, preserved almost exclusively within the nascent ecclesiastical courts, while local economic activity regressed towards localized barter and subsistence farming. This critical dissolution of centralized fiscal and governmental control created the specific socio-political and economic vacuum into which new Slavic populations would soon migrate, providing the essential, undefended staging ground for the creation of future medieval principalities. The transformation of the Roman Balkans into a definitively Slavic space was not a singular event, but a complex demographic process, primarily dated between the late 6th and early 7th centuries. This movement originated north of the Danube line, traversing the passes of the Carpathian Mountains and utilizing the great river valleys as primary arteries for southward diffusion. Early evidence suggests these migrations were often conducted under the military umbrella of the Avar Khaganate, a Turkic-speaking nomadic power based in the Pannonian Plain. The Slavs frequently served as the siege infantry and settler component in Avar campaigns, particularly those targeting Byzantine territories south of the Sava and Danube rivers. Archaeological indicators of this arrival manifest distinct patterns that differentiate them from the preceding late antique material record. The emergence of new settlement types is crucial. The widespread adoption of the semi-subterranean dwelling, or zimunica, built partially below ground level with a stone or wattle and daub roof, signifies a radical departure from Roman housing traditions. These settlements, typically small and dispersed, demonstrate a transition to a self-sufficient, localized economy, heavily reliant on newly introduced pottery forms. Specifically, the earliest recognizable material culture associated with the Slavic newcomers is often defined by coarse, handmade ceramic vessels, undecorated or featuring simple incised wave patterns, which stand in stark contrast to the wheel-made, standardized Roman wares previously common across the region. The distribution of these archaeological horizons illustrates a settlement preference away from the old Roman civic centers. While Roman populations had congregated in fortified cities or clustered along the main imperial roads, the incoming Slavs established new villages near fertile river plains and forests, prioritizing access to agricultural resources over defensive topography. This pattern suggests a deliberate, or perhaps necessary, initial avoidance of direct conflict with the fortified Byzantine coastal towns and the organized local defense within the surviving Romanized enclaves. This demographic separation allowed the indigenous Romanized Daco-Moesians and Illyrians to persist within the Dalmatian urban centers for an extended period, maintaining linguistic and ecclesiastical continuity with Constantinople. The precise timing of the final ethnic consolidation is difficult to isolate due to the inherently slow nature of cultural change and assimilation. The integration process often relied on economic necessity, with Slavic communities providing agricultural goods to the coastal towns in exchange for salt or manufactured iron tools. Furthermore, the early medieval chroniclers, notably the 10th century work De Administrando Imperio, tend to present the complex multi-generational settlement as a singular, heroic migration sanctioned by an emperor. This narrative simplification, driven by political expediency, often obscures the long-term organic settlement of the various South Slavic groups, including the Croats and Serbs, who would later emerge as dominant political entities in their respective regions. The archaeological record, therefore, serves as the primary factual corrective to these later mythic origins, revealing an adaptive society gradually substituting a new material and social order for the decayed remnants of Roman life. The geopolitical reality of the 7th and 8th centuries in the Balkan Peninsula was dominated by the military and political influence of two major external powers, the nomadic Avar Khaganate to the north and the residual authority of the Byzantine Empire centered on Constantinople. Following the successful waves of Slavic settlement, the Croat-inhabited territories found themselves situated directly between these competing spheres of power, a position that dictated both their internal development and their earliest diplomatic engagements. The Avar Khaganate, whose power base lay in the Pannonian Basin, exerted paramount military pressure across the entire region. The Avar organizational structure, defined by a highly mobile and effective heavy cavalry, relied heavily on controlling and taxing subject populations, including the newly arrived Slavic groups. The Avar presence was not administrative but military. Their authority was enforced through tribute demands and the threat of punitive expeditions. This relationship imposed a form of mandatory military service upon the early Croat leadership, compelling their chieftains to participate in raids and siege operations against Byzantine strongholds, particularly the isolated coastal cities that still resisted direct mainland control. This pressure fostered the initial unification of smaller Croat tribal groups, driven by the necessity of coordinating a defense force capable of meeting Avar demands or resisting their overreach. Conversely, the Byzantine Empire maintained a form of theoretical suzerainty over the entire Dalmatian littoral, and the adjacent territories. While imperial military resources were severely stretched by conflicts with the Arabs and Bulgars, Constantinople relied on a historical claim to the former Roman provinces. This authority was physically represented by the Dalmatian city-states such as Zadar, Split, and Trogir, which remained loyal, ethnically Roman, and governed by Byzantine strategos, military governors. These cities formed the westernmost extent of the imperial theme system. The empire employed a strategy of soft power, leveraging its cultural prestige, wealth, and its control over the vital Adriatic trade routes to secure the fealty of the emergent Slavic principalities. Byzantine diplomacy, often involving the granting of honorary titles, military commands, or annual subsidies known as pacta to Slavic archonts, was designed to counter Avar influence without committing expensive armies. The early Croat dukes navigated this dual allegiance, often pledging fealty to the Byzantine emperor to gain leverage against Avar demands, only to seek Avar military support in internal tribal conflicts. The resulting political landscape was highly unstable, defined by swift shifts in alliance dictated by which power offered the greatest immediate benefit or posed the most significant threat. This continuous external pressure, both nomadic and imperial, ultimately acted as a catalyst, forcing local Slavic leaders to transcend simple tribal structures and develop the more centralized political organization necessary to manage foreign relations and taxation. The dual shadow cast by the Khaganate and the empire thus prevented the early Croat territories from consolidating as truly independent entities throughout the 7th and much of the 8th century. The dramatic military successes of the Carolingian dynasty at the close of the 8th century precipitated a critical reorientation of power across the southeastern European sphere. Between 791 and 803, Charlemagne's focused campaigns effectively dismantled the Avar military and political organization across the Pannonian plain, eradicating the dominant nomadic threat that had previously constrained Slavic political development. The elimination of the Khaganate's authority resulted in a significant power vacuum that extended Frankish political and military influence eastward into the territories newly settled by Croat communities. The Carolingian administration immediately sought to integrate these strategically located territories, not through direct assimilation, but by establishing them as defensive client polities within their expansive Eastern March structure. This policy resulted in the formal segmentation of the Croat lands into two distinct administrative units, a bifurcation rooted in geography and defensive necessity. To the north, adjacent to the Sava and Drava rivers, lay the Duchy of Pannonian Croatia, often referred to as Posavina. Its organization was structured primarily to defend the newly established Frankish border against potential subsequent pressure from the Bulgars. South of the Gvozd mountain and extending along the coast was the Duchy of Dalmatian Croatia, or Primorje, which maintained a continuous, though often hostile, frontier with the remaining Byzantine coastal cities. In both newly formed principalities, the indigenous Slavic chieftain was acknowledged as the paramount local ruler, designated by the imperial court with the title dux or princeps. Crucially, this authority was entirely conditional, resting upon the dux's sworn acceptance of the Carolingian emperor as his unquestioned overlord. This relationship established a clear system of vassalage, where the Croat rulers were explicitly obliged to provide specific military aid, chiefly cavalry and infantry detachments for major Frankish campaigns, and simultaneously had to tolerate the institutional presence of Frankish counts or prefects. These Frankish officials oversaw the regional administration and were primarily tasked with ensuring consistent military readiness and the mandated collection of local revenue to support the imperial defense system. This administrative integration inevitably generated profound tension. The Frankish attempt to impose a developed feudal structure and centralized imperial administrative mechanisms clashed directly with the nascent processes of local Slavic state formation. While the Croat dukes often sought legitimacy through alliance with the powerful Carolingians, they fiercely resisted the tangible encroachment of foreign regional military and civil authority, the principal friction centered on matters of local judicial jurisdiction, the frequent requisitioning of manpower for foreign military service, and the imposition of taxes levied solely to support the distant imperial defensive perimeter. This deep-seated internal resentment against the installation of a foreign administrative layer ultimately culminated in widespread internal resistance, demonstrating the inherent instability and short duration of the Frankish client-state model in this part of the Balkans during the early 9th century. The transition from Frankish military occupation to formalized vassalage introduced the first reliably attested ruler of Dalmatian Croatia, Duke Vítislav. Though historical documentation is sparse regarding his specific acts of governance, his existence, likely situated in the final decade of the 8th century or the initial years of the 9th, confirms a pivotal stage of political consolidation. The most tangible evidence of his era is the famed Vítislav's baptistery from the city of Nin, a crucial cultural artifact that underscores the adherence of the nascent Croatian elite to the Latin West. The octagonal stone baptismal font, although debated by scholars as to whether it was directly commissioned by the Duke himself, undeniably represents the patronage of a localized ruling class towards sophisticated Christian architecture. The material sophistication and specific liturgical function of the font demonstrate that the conversion process was fully underway among the elite, reflecting a strategic alignment with the religious hierarchy centered in Rome and its representative on the Adriatic coast. This religious adherence carried critical geopolitical weight, positioning the Dalmatian Croats within the Carolingian sphere of influence rather than the Byzantine ecclesiastical network. The adoption of Roman rites and the Latin cultural matrix provided an essential diplomatic currency for negotiating with the Frankish overlords. The Frankish administrative apparatus, fundamentally tied to the preservation of the Roman Christian political order, viewed the conversion of newly settled Slavic leaders as a vital indicator of stable governance and reliable fealty. Vítislav's implicit or explicit support for the establishment of Latin ecclesiastical structures thus served to legitimize his dux title in the eyes of the imperial court. However, the Duke's position demanded a delicate strategic calculus. While acknowledging the Frankish emperor as the ultimate military authority, as stipulated by the terms of vassalage, Vítislav simultaneously focused on consolidating his personal authority over the scattered Croat Županije counties and minimizing the daily interference of Frankish counts or prefects. The nascent ducal court functioned as the primary mechanism for centralizing military resources and local judicial jurisdiction, preventing the fragmentation of power that characterized purely tribal organization. The foundation of early religious centers served a dual purpose. They were locations for Christian instruction and symbolic hubs for demonstrating the Duke's regional power, creating an essential political infrastructure independent of direct Frankish military presence. Therefore, Vítislav's actions mark the shift from purely military submission to a calculated diplomacy of survival, where cultural alignment was leveraged to gain political autonomy within the restrictive framework of the Carolingian Empire. The early 9th century witnessed the volatile consequences of the Frankish system of client rule, culminating in a major internal upheaval known as the Udovit Rebellion, which spanned the years 819 through 822. The crux of this conflict lay in the Pannonian March, where Slavic populations chafed under the fiscal and administrative demands imposed by the regional Frankish officials, particularly the Margraves of Friuli. Chief among these indigenous resistors was Ludovit, the Duke of Pannonian Croatia. His primary stated grievances, recorded in the contemporary Annales Regni Francorum, Royal Frankish Annals, centered on the insupportable insolence and abusive behavior of the Frankish military commanders who held jurisdiction over the Sava and Drava valleys. In stark contrast to the rising resistance in the north, Duke Borna of Dalmatian Croatia proved to be a steadfast and crucial ally to the Carolingian imperial project. Borna is formally recognized in Frankish sources with the extended title Dux Dalmatiae atque Liburniae, confirming his regional control over both the coastal territories and the area inhabited by the old Liburnian tribe. His strategic policy was one of absolute and unwavering loyalty, viewing the Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious as the indispensable guarantor of his own ducal authority. This alliance affirmed the distinct political and military priorities of the two adjacent Croat principalities. The rebellion commenced in 819, when Ljudevit openly challenged the authority of the Frankish-appointed Margrave, Cadola of Friuli, successfully defeating his forces in battle. This initial success galvanized other Slavic groups, including the Carantanians and Carniolans, to join the revolt, dramatically escalating the threat to Frankish control in southeastern Europe. Duke Borna immediately activated his treaty obligations, placing his military forces at the disposal of the imperial court. His Dalmatian troops, possessing superior knowledge of the difficult Dinaric terrain and organized under a cohesive command, became essential auxiliaries for the Frankish counteroffensive. The ensuing conflict, spanning 3 tumultuous years, was primarily a war of attrition across the Central European interior. Borna's direct participation was vital. He engaged Ljudevit's forces on multiple fronts, often suffering heavy casualties, including a devastating loss near the River Kupa during the rebellion's initial thrust. Despite these setbacks, Borna's consistent military pressure compelled Ljudevit to divert significant resources from his main conflict with the central Frankish armies. This strategic distraction proved crucial. By 821, due to relentless Frankish pressure, sustained famine, and the unwavering hostility of Borna's forces, Ljudevit was forced to abandon his Pannonian stronghold and eventually fled the region. Borna's loyal service yielded a clear, immediate political reward. Though he died soon after the rebellion was crushed, the Frankish emperor explicitly confirmed the legitimacy of his successor, chosen from within his immediate ducal family. This affirmation of his newly consolidated dynasty insulated Dalmatian Croatia from the administrative chaos and political punishment that followed the revolt's collapse in the Pannonian territories. The failure of the Ljudevit rebellion thus affirmed the geopolitical principle that, during this formative period, only strategic fealty to the dominant Western military power could ensure the political longevity of a local Slavic dynasty. The reign of Duke Tomislav in Dalmatian Croatia, dating approximately to the years 835 through 845, marks a decisive turning point in the young principality's geopolitical focus, shifting its strategic priority from merely internal land consolidation to asserting control over the immediate maritime zone. This reorientation was necessitated by evolving economic realities and continuous defensive pressures in the Adriatic, specifically from the powerful established coastal communes and the growing naval strength of Venice. Mislav's period of rule is fundamentally characterized by the systematic development of a native Croatian naval capability. This was not a fleet built for distant expeditions, but an essential defensive force structured to secure the vital coastal sea lanes and assert sovereignty over the immediate archipelago. The economic imperative driving this naval policy was straightforward: control the flow of goods and exact tribute from foreign vessels utilizing the sheltered waters along the Dalmatian coast. The Adriatic served as a crucial north-south maritime corridor, connecting the Byzantine Empire and the burgeoning commercial centers of Italy with the inland Balkan trade networks. To safeguard this lucrative opportunity, Mislav's administration initiated the systematic construction of war galleys, likely utilizing the abundant timber resources from the nearby Dinaric forests. These vessels, swift and maneuverable, were primarily crewed by seasoned coastal inhabitants whose traditions were inherently linked to the sea. The first major military validation of this new Croatian naval power came in direct confrontation with the Venetian Republic. Venice, already viewing the entire eastern Adriatic as its essential commercial sphere, consistently launched punitive expeditions against the mainland Slavs who threatened their mercantile routes and interests. In the year 839, Doge Pietro Tredonico led a significant Venetian fleet southward, intent on restoring free passage and eliminating the emerging Croatian maritime threat. Mislav's newly organized fleet engaged the Venetians in open combat near the region of Sissa, modern Pag or possibly Kirk, demonstrating unexpected organizational coherence and ferocity. While the outcome of the initial engagement near Sissa was tactically inconclusive, it forced the Venetians to seek a formal cessation of hostilities. In 839, Mislav and Doge Tredonico concluded a peace treaty that temporarily stabilized the volatile maritime frontier. This diplomatic recognition from Venice was highly significant, as it implicitly acknowledged the Dalmatian Croats not merely as land-based brigands, but as a sovereign power capable of fielding a professional naval force. This established a critical precedent for future Croatian rulers. True political viability required military dominance both on land and at sea. This foundational naval success transitioned Croatian foreign policy from one of passive defense to one of active maritime assertion, fundamentally laying the groundwork for later medieval claims to the Dalmatian coastal cities. The ascension of Trpimir I to the ducal throne, estimated around the mid-9th century, circa 845, initiated a hereditary lineage that would dominate the political trajectory of the medieval Croatian state for centuries, the Trpimirović dynasty. Unlike previous rulers whose authority often relied heavily on Frankish military endorsement, Trpimir focused on codifying and institutionalizing his governance through indigenous legal and ecclesiastical structures. His seminal political action is preserved in the Trpimir Charter, dated approximately to the year 852, a document that transcended a simple land grant to establish fundamental principles of state legitimacy. The charter granted holdings to the Archbishopric of Split, but, more critically, it was in this text that the ruler identified himself not merely as a Frankish client, but as Dux Croatorum, the Duke of the Croats. This charter's significance is amplified by its theological claims. The introduction to the legal provisions invoked the concept of the ducal power originating Divina Fritas Munere, meaning supported by God's gift. This declaration served to detach his authority from reliance on the Carolingian emperor's explicit confirmation, asserting a direct, divinely sanctioned mandate for his rule over the local population. This was a pivotal step in developing a sovereign political identity. While the principality technically remained within the orbit of the fading Frankish hegemony, the ideological groundwork was laid for independence by positioning the Croatian ruler as God's chosen representative, not merely a foreign military governor's appointee. Further illustrating the expanded reach of the new dynasty, Trpimir engaged in significant military diversions away from the Adriatic and Frankish frontiers. Recognizing the emergent threat from the Bulgarian Empire, which was rapidly consolidating its power in the Central Balkans, Trpimir successfully defended the eastern border of his territories. These strategic engagements against the powerful Bulgarian forces prevented the incursion of a major new power into the Dalmatian hinterland, thereby securing his territorial integrity and confirming the principality's status as a formidable regional military entity capable of coordinated defense. The ducal court, established by Trpimir, served as the administrative core of this expanding state. Located initially near the religious center of Byzantine, the court facilitated the conversion of Frankish-derived military ranks into formalized court titles and established clear judicial hierarchies across the inland Županije. The alliance between the duke and the indigenous Croatian clergy, particularly the Bishop of Nin, was actively promoted to balance the political influence of the Latinate bishoprics in the Byzantine-held coastal cities. This calculated support for a native ecclesiastical structure provided a cultural and administrative counterweight to external religious and political pressures. Trpimir's reign, lasting until approximately 864, thus synthesized local feudal power with a foundational legal document and a direct theological claim to authority, successfully transitioning the realm from a mere territorial entity to a nascent sovereign state. The years immediately following the death of Trpimir I, around 864, initiated a period of pronounced political instability and dynastic fluidity within Dalmatian Croatia. This turbulence stemmed directly from the principality's strategic position, caught between the competing spheres of influence exerted by the Western Frankish Empire and the Eastern Byzantine Empire. The power vacuum created by Tripomir's death was initially seized by a challenger named Domagoj, who violently usurped the ducal seat and drove the legitimate Tripomirovich heirs, including a young Zdeslav, into exile, likely under Frankish protection. Domagoj's initial reign, 864–876, was marked by a resolute policy of independence from Frankish administrative oversight, often leading to direct military confrontations with Carolingian forces in the northern Adriatic. His reputation was cemented through aggressive naval action, primarily targeting the burgeoning maritime trade interests of the Italian communes and the Byzantine-aligned coastal settlements. The political balance was dramatically reversed in 878, when a Byzantine-backed faction successfully orchestrated the return of Zdeslav, the exiled son of Tripomir. Zdeslav's short reign, 878–879, represents a brief but crucial pro-Byzantine interlude, fundamentally realigning the Croatian principality's foreign policy. Upon ascending the throne, Zdeslav formally acknowledged the suzerainty of the Byzantine Emperor Basil I, effectively transferring Dalmatian Croatia from the Frankish orbit back to Constantinople's sphere. This geopolitical shift was not merely symbolic, it carried tangible military and administrative implications. Zdeslav secured the expulsion of any remaining Frankish priests and administrative officials from the interior. Furthermore, his authority was confirmed by the dispatch of Byzantine military garrisons to key locations within the principality, providing him with the necessary coercive power to neutralize domestic opposition inherited from the previous regime. This move secured temporary regional stability by subordinating the emerging local power to a distant yet militarily capable imperial authority. However, Zdeslav's pro-Byzantine orientation proved untenable among powerful elements of the native nobility, who favored the political and military support offered by the Western Church and the Frankish Empire. This underlying tension fueled the subsequent countercoup. In 879, Domagoj's son Branimir, who had also been in exile and maintained strong ties with the pro-Western elements, led a successful uprising. Zdeslav was assassinated, ending the brief Tripomirovich restoration and concluding the Byzantine period of direct influence. Branimir's coup was a deliberate political act designed to sever the newly forged links with the East. He immediately repudiated Byzantine suzerainty and reversed Zdeslav's policies, firmly orienting the principality back toward the Western sphere. His subsequent correspondence with Pope John VIII was a direct effort to legitimize his violent seizure of power and establish a foundation for political recognition independent of both imperial claims. This rapid sequence of regime change Domagoj's Frankish opposition, Zdeslav's Byzantine shift, and Branimir's Western reorientation demonstrates the immense pressure on the young state to navigate the competing imperial power structures of the era. The violent seizure of the ducal title by Domagoj in 864, which displaced the established Tripomirovich lineage, inaugurated a period characterized by pronounced military aggression and an unyielding commitment to political autonomy. Having secured his position, Domagoj's immediate policy was defined by a categorical rejection of direct administrative oversight from both the Byzantine and Frankish imperial centers. He effectively capitalized on the ongoing fragmentation of Carolingian authority in the mid-9th century, ceasing the regular payment of traditional Frankish subsidies and asserting full control over the governance of the Dalmatian interior. This action was a calculated risk that elevated the principality's status from a subordinate client state to an independent military power capable of charting its own diplomatic course without imperial dictation. Domagoj systematically ramped up the nascent Croatian naval capability into a disciplined force dedicated to privateering and the extraction of tribute. His navy did not merely defend the coast, It proactively engaged in naval warfare against the powerful Italian city-states. This aggressive strategy aimed at forcing the communes, particularly Venice, to negotiate formalized treaties that included the payment of annual tributes, known as census, in exchange for safe passage through the eastern Adriatic. The Venetian Doge Orso Partecipazio eventually launched a large-scale retaliatory strike, leading to a major conflict in 865, demonstrating the severity of Domagoj's challenge to Venetian maritime supremacy. Despite the prolonged nature of this naval conflict, the Croatian fleet's sustained interdiction of vital sea lanes inflicted sufficient economic damage on Venetian interests to compel a temporary, grudging recognition of Croatian dominance in the northern Adriatic waters. This relentless military and political ambition, however, was reflected in a domestic regime of extreme ruthlessness. Domagoj's actions against internal dissent and regional competitors earned him an infamous designation from contemporary ecclesiastical sources. The papal chancellery, under Pope John VIII, referred to him as the scourge of the Slavs, Sclavorum Pessimus, a rare and damning epithet that underscored the scale of his internal purges and the violent nature of his rule, which extended to the brutal elimination of political rivals and their families. This moniker speaks less to his conflicts with foreign powers and more to the consolidation of his authority through terror within the fractured Slavic polities of the region. The Duke's influence extended beyond the Adriatic and the Balkans when he forged a temporary expedient alliance with the Frankish King Louis II. In 871, Domagoj dispatched a substantial Croatian naval contingent to participate in the joint Frankish-Byzantine siege of the Arab-held city of Bari in southern Italy. This involvement demonstrated the principality's naval reach and its ability to contribute meaningful military strength to major European coalition operations. Although this act was technically in support of an imperial initiative, it was fundamentally a display of independent military capability on the international stage, underscoring that Domagoj, far from being a vassal, commanded a powerful autonomous force whose allegiance was purely transactional. His death in 876 concluded a reign that definitively established the Croatian Principality as an essential and highly coercive factor in the geopolitical calculations of the Adriatic powers. The reign of Branimir, circa 879–892, marks the definitive pivot of the Dalmatian-Croatian Principality toward achieving de jure political independence, fundamentally altering its geopolitical status in the European system. Branimir, having seized power through a counter-coup that deposed the pro-Byzantine Duke Zedzlav, immediately set about formalizing his rule by seeking direct recognition from the highest spiritual authority of the West, the papacy. His objective was to bypass the traditional layered imperial hierarchies, both Frankish and Byzantine, that had previously dictated the terms of Croatian sovereignty. This diplomatic maneuver culminated in a critical exchange of letters with Pope John VIII. Branimir's strategic calculus was impeccable. He understood that while military might secure territory, only papal blessing conferred legitimate international standing free of secular imperial oversight. The papal letters confirm that the Duke formally acknowledged the Pope as his spiritual superior, ensuring the stability and prosperity of the Catholic faith within his borders. In return, the Pope delivered a specific and powerful act of recognition. On Ascension Day, May 21, 879, during a solemn Mass, Pope John VIII invoked a blessing upon Branimir, his people, and his entire domain. This act, documented in the papal register, was interpreted by Branimir's court not merely as a spiritual favour, but as official international recognition of his independent status. The implication of this recognition was profound. The papacy effectively treated Branimir as a sovereign ruler on equal footing with other European monarchs, deliberately bypassing the claims of Frankish overlordship. The correspondence emphasized the notion of a separate entity and ceased the direct administrative communications that had previously flowed through the Frankish hierarchy. This diplomatic isolation from the Carolingian administration was crucial, as the papacy itself was engaged in a complex relationship with the Frankish emperors and welcomed a new, independent ally on the Adriatic. Branimir expertly leveraged the rivalry between the secular imperial courts and the spiritual power of Rome to carve out his state's diplomatic space. The Duke's foreign policy extended to the Adriatic itself, capitalizing on the naval dominance established by his predecessor, Domagoj. Branimir continued to enforce the systematic collection of maritime duties from Venetian ships. This economic coercion forced Venice to formalize existing tribute arrangements. The Venetian Doge agreed to pay an annual tribute pactum to the Croatian ruler for safe navigation along the eastern Adriatic coast. This diplomatic and financial settlement solidified the principality's fiscal base and affirmed its military control over vital sea lanes, proving that the papal recognition was backed by tangible, coercive regional power. Branimir's long and stable reign, spanning nearly 13 years, thus transitioned the principality from a volatile, dependent territory into a recognized, functional, and self-sufficient independent political entity. The reign of Duke Mutimir, c. 892–910, brother of the influential Branimir, maintained the external political independence secured during the previous decades, but shifted the primary focus towards stabilizing the ecclesiastical structures of the emerging state. This era was defined by the complex, often contentious relationship between the established Latin hierarchy in the Byzantine-aligned coastal cities and the burgeoning Slavic clergy operating in the Croatian interior. The spiritual jurisdiction over the principality was a fiercely contested resource, with Rome asserting its authority over the nascent Croatian bishoprics, simultaneously navigating the entrenched traditions of the ancient Dalmatian seas. A critical organizational development during this period involved the revival of the Metropolitan Archbishopric in Split. This city, built around Diocletian's palatial complex, claimed apostolic succession dating back to the late Roman period, granting it significant ecclesiastical prestige. The re-establishment of Split's archiepiscopal authority, although initially challenged by claims from the Archdiocese of Aquileia to the north, was crucial for providing a formalized administrative structure for the church across Dalmatia and the Croatian hinterland. The objective was to bring all local bishoprics, including the developing centers in the interior, under a unified Roman-sanctioned jurisdiction, effectively curbing the independence of individual bishops. The fundamental conflict, however, lay in the liturgical language. The coastal cities, such as Split, Zadar, and Trogir, firmly maintained the Latin rite, adhering to Roman ecclesiastical norms and utilizing Latin as the sole language for worship and record-keeping. The interior, conversely, saw the widespread adoption of the Slavic liturgy, introduced by clergy who had absorbed the traditions originating from the missionary work of Cyril and Methodius. These Slavic priests employed the vernacular language in Mass and utilized the unique glagolitic script for sacred texts, a practice viewed with deep suspicion by the Roman hierarchy, which feared that a vernacular liturgy would foster schism and heresy. This tension exploded into formal debate during the Great Synods of Split in the 10th century. Although Mutimir's direct involvement predated the major synods of 925 and 928, the issues addressed were a direct inheritance of his era. These gatherings were convened to resolve the competing jurisdictional claims and standardize liturgical practice. The assembled papal legates and Latin bishops ruled categorically against the Slavic clergy, condemning the use of the vernacular liturgy and the ordination of priests who did not understand Latin. Specifically, the Synod of 925, reinforced by papal decree, prohibited the use of Slavic in the Mass, asserting the primacy of the Latin language as the true language of the Church. The intent was to impose the cultural and administrative uniformity of the Latin West, consolidating the influence of the coastal archdiocese over the inland Slavic populations. Despite these formal rulings, the Slavic clergy demonstrated remarkable resilience and cultural tenacity. They were deeply embedded in the rural populace, whose language and traditions they shared, ensuring that the vernacular liturgy continued informally in many interior regions, defying the official metropolitan prohibitions. This resistance created a de facto dual ecclesiastical system, a formal Latin hierarchy in the cities centered in Split, focused on aligning with Rome, and a persistent popular Slavic right in the hinterland, concentrated around key regional political centers like Nin. This enduring struggle over liturgical language was not merely a theological dispute, but a critical front in the young state's attempt to define its own cultural identity while remaining tethered to the spiritual and political orbit of Western Europe. The ascension of Tomislav to power around 910 AD marked a watershed moment through the definitive unification of the formerly distinct Pannonian and Dalmatian Croatian polities. Tomislav inherited a duchy that was already diplomatically independent, but his immediate priority was the military and administrative integration of territories stretching from the Adriatic coast inland to the Drava and Sava rivers. This political consolidation was not merely an internal restructuring, it was a necessary defensive response to a major external geopolitical shock, the aggressive expansion of the nomadic Magyar tribes. Having swept across the Danube and shattered the remaining Frankish administrative control over the eastern Carolingian March, the Magyars destabilized the entire Pannonian basin. The remnants of the indigenous Pannonian Slavic leadership and populace, displaced and under existential threat, retreated south and west, finding protection under Tomislav's military banner. By absorbing these fragmented Pannonian entities, Tomislav effectively extended his military frontier northwards and doubled the territorial reach of the Croatian state. This success in consolidating the Primorje coastland and the formerly independent Slav territories of the Posavina Sava River Valley justified a formal change in the ruler's designation. Historical consensus places the elevation of Tomislav's title to Rex, king, around 925 AD. While the specific record of the coronation ceremony remains absent from surviving sources, his recognition as the first Croatian king is substantiated by an invaluable contemporary papal correspondence, specifically the letter of Pope John X, referencing the Rex Croatorum. This new title did not merely satisfy vanity. It confirmed the political reality of a state that had grown vastly in scale and was capable of exercising authority over a wide and heterogeneous population. This elevated status also provided the necessary diplomatic gravity for engagement with major imperial powers. Tomislav leveraged this newfound royal dignity and military strength into a crucial strategic alliance with the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, viewing the expansive Croatian state as a potential bulwark against both the Magyars in the north and the increasingly aggressive Bulgarian Empire in the east, formally acknowledged Tomislav's status. As part of this pragmatic military arrangement, the Byzantine emperor likely delegated administrative authority over the coastal cities of Dalmatia to Tomislav, essentially leasing out imperial assets in exchange for military assurance. This arrangement granted him direct local jurisdiction over key Adriatic ports, further enhancing his state's unity and economic leverage. The comprehensive nature of this unified kingdom is attested to by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus. Writing in De Administrando Imperio, the emperor detailed the impressive military capacity of the Croatian realm. He specifically recorded that the country could field an army of 60,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. While scholars debate the exact precision of these figures, they unequivocally confirm that the early 10th century Croatian state was organized, unified, and possessed a massive, powerful military machine, a regional force capable of sustained defense and strategic projection, which distinguished it from the smaller, more volatile duchies of the preceding centuries. The creation of the Kingdom of Croatia under Tomislav was thus the political culmination of military necessity and successful diplomatic maneuvering in a chaotic Central European environment. The newly unified Croatian kingdom under King Tomislav immediately faced a dual, severe external threat that tested the resilience of its military structure. Following their aggressive consolidation of the Pannonian Basin, the Magyar nomadic tribes initiated significant incursions southward across the Drava River. These raids targeted the fertile lands of Tomislav's newly integrated Pannonian territories, seeking plunder and aiming to destabilize the northern frontier. The Croatian response to this invasion was decisive and well organized. Utilizing the substantial military force detailed in contemporary imperial records, Tomislav's army engaged the Magyar cavalry, achieving a crucial and definitive victory. This successful defense proved the efficacy of the centralized command structure established during Tomislav's unification process and secured the northern boundary of the kingdom for generations, halting the Magyar expansion towards the Adriatic. This military accomplishment was essential, demonstrating to both internal and external observers that the Kingdom of Croatia possessed the organizational capacity to counter major regional powers. The second, and more consequential, conflict erupted with the powerful Bulgarian Empire. Under the formidable leadership of Tsar Simeon I, Bulgaria had reached its territorial and military zenith, expanding relentlessly westward and threatening the Byzantine hold on the Balkans. Simeon, having repeatedly defeated Byzantine forces, sought to eliminate the Croatian kingdom, which stood as a vital Byzantine ally, blocking his direct access to the Adriatic coast and the strategically significant Dalmatian cities. The conflict was a direct consequence of Tomislav's pragmatic alliance with Constantinople, an agreement which included granting the Croatian king administrative oversight of the Dalmatian urban centers in exchange for military assistance against Simeon. The final and most critical confrontation between Croatian and Bulgarian forces occurred around 927 AD. Tsar Simeon dispatched a massive invasion force, led by his most experienced general, Duke Alagabota, towards the Croatian heartland. The Byzantine emperor, Romanus I Lecapenus, confirmed the critical nature of this conflict, relying on the Croatian army to blunt the Bulgarian advance. The decisive engagement took place in the rugged mountain terrain of eastern Bosnia, a region ideally suited for defensive tactics and infantry maneuvers. The Croatian army engaged the numerically superior Bulgarian forces, securing a crushing military victory. The Bulgarian army was not only repelled, but reportedly annihilated. The magnitude of the defeat was such that the Bulgarian state immediately ceased its expansion westward and never again posed a significant threat to the Croatian state's existence. The immediate geopolitical consequence was the preservation of the regional balance of power, ensuring Byzantine dominance in the coastal Adriatic remained intact, albeit through a Croatian proxy. The victory unequivocally demonstrated Croatia's power projection into the wider Balkan sphere, positioning it as a mandatory strategic partner for Constantinople and confirming its status as the supreme military power in the Western Balkans. This military prowess validated the elevated title of Rex Croatorum in the eyes of the major European powers, and concluded the initial phase of the kingdom's military consolidation. The period following Croatia's firm establishment as a kingdom necessitated a sophisticated, multifaceted foreign policy that looked beyond the immediate pressures of Rome, Byzantium, and the newly settled Magyars. The Tripimirovich kings recognized the critical utility of inter-Slavic diplomacy, cultivating kinship and political pacts with other newly Christianized dynasties emerging across Central and Eastern Europe. This strategic expansion of the state's diplomatic horizon aimed to create a robust counterbalance to the overarching influence of the Holy Roman Empire to the northwest and the Hungarian Principality to the immediate north. The most notable of these alliances involved the Piast rulers of Poland. Although direct contemporary charters detailing marital bonds are scarce, genealogical research and later chronicler accounts strongly suggest reciprocal marriage diplomacy occurred during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Such matrimonial exchanges functioned as non-aggression treaties and military insurance policies, binding the royal houses in shared lineage and mutual obligation. This kinship strategy allowed both Zagreb and Gniezno to coordinate their political posturing, particularly concerning ecclesiastical affairs and territorial defense against aggressive neighbors. Similarly, the relationship with the Przemyslid dynasty in the Bohemian lands provided an additional layer of diplomatic depth. Geographically, the Croatian-Bohemian axis offered a potential route of communication and military reinforcement that skirted Magyar territories. While the Bohemian state was often preoccupied with internal struggles and its own proximity to the German frontier, Political pacts ensured a zone of friendly neutrality, allowing the Croatian monarchy freedom to focus its military resources on the more volatile Dalmatian and Bosnian frontiers. These non-military alliances offered a degree of strategic predictability vital for a smaller power situated between multiple imperial spheres. A significant outcome of this expanded diplomatic network was the strengthening of Slavic cultural identity relative to the dominant Latin and Greek influences. By engaging as equals with the courts of Misko I and his successors, the Croatian kingdom reaffirmed its cultural legitimacy within the broader Slavic world, providing implicit support for the continued use of Slavic traditions and language within its borders. Croatian rulers utilized their kingdom's geographic position, acting as a critical nexus between the Balkan Slavs and the West Slavs, to enhance their diplomatic value. This allowed them to receive and dispatch embassies bearing political intelligence and commercial agreements, positioning the Trpimirović court as a pivotal regional partner rather than merely a subject of Roman or Byzantine policy. These ties, founded on shared language and Christian faith, represent a deliberate and successful effort by the early Croatian kings to diversify their political capital and secure the kingdom's sovereignty on a truly European stage. The reign of Stephen Dujislav, spanning approximately 3 decades, occurred within the turbulent geopolitical framework of the Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars, a protracted and existential conflict dominating the central and eastern Balkan peninsula. The consolidation of Bulgarian power under Tsar Samuel, who aggressively expanded his territorial claims toward the Adriatic, made the Croatian kingdom an indispensable, high-value asset for Constantinople. Druzislav's court, initially maneuvering to maintain equilibrium between the two empires, pragmatically aligned firmly with the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, recognizing the superior strategic advantage offered by an alliance with the established imperial authority. This political alignment was formalized as a strategic military exchange. Družislav agreed to provide crucial military support, deploying significant land forces to secure the vulnerable western flank of the Byzantine defense structure against Samuel's advances. This service extended to patrolling the seas, ensuring that the necessary communication and supply lines between the Byzantine strongholds in the coastal Dalmatian cities and the imperial capital were not severed by hostile action. This military obligation placed the Croatian army in a position of respect and direct cooperation with Byzantine commanders, enhancing its professional experience and technical capabilities. The primary recompense for this military fealty was the conferral of high symbolic and ceremonial dignities directly from the emperor in Constantinople. Basil II, intent on securing Druzislav's uninterrupted loyalty, granted the Croatian ruler the prestigious imperial title of Eparch, or Patricios, an honorary distinction that positioned the Croatian court within the hierarchical framework of the Byzantine aristocracy. More critically, the emperor dispatched royal insignia to the Croatian capital. This collection of ceremonial regalia, likely including a formal crown, a silk mantle, and a scepter, served a profound legitimizing function. It provided visible, tangible evidence of the Croatian ruler's elevation to the rank of king, sanctioned by the universally acknowledged authority of the senior Christian emperor. The receipt of these imperial symbols was not a mere stylistic upgrade. It structurally entrenched the ceremonial legitimacy of the Trpimirović dynasty. The title Basilius, king, when formally acknowledged by Constantinople, confirmed Croatia's political status as a state entity of sovereign importance on the European stage. This imperial validation was a powerful tool used by Dujislav to unify the disparate administrative and noble factions within his realm, neutralizing any lingering claims by internal rivals who might question his elevated authority. Furthermore, this alliance secured administrative control over the vital coastal Dalmatian cities. Previously held directly by Byzantine strategoi governors, these lucrative urban centers and their surrounding territories were placed under Dujislav's direct authority, ensuring their effective defense and facilitating the political unification of the Dalmatian coast with the Slavic hinterland. This transfer of authority allowed the Croatian king to project a unified government from the mountainous interior to the most significant urban ports on the Adriatic. The geopolitical landscape of the early 11th century was fundamentally altered by the assertive expansionism of the Venetian Republic. Following a period of uneasy truce maintained through earlier payment obligations, the equilibrium fractured under the reign of King Krešimir III. His rule was defined by the necessity of challenging the ascending maritime power, which had systematically leveraged its commercial dominance to assert political control over the vital coastal cities. The Dalmatian urban centres, including Zadar, Split, and Trogir, historically remained under nominal Byzantine oversight, yet their wealth and economic orientation were increasingly tied to the commercial networks of the Republic of Streetmark. Venice viewed the strategic control of the eastern Adriatic shore, known as the Regnum Dalmatiae, as indispensable to securing its trade routes to the Levant and maintaining a strong defensive posture in the Adriatic basin. This struggle intensified dramatically around 1018 AD, when a new phase of Venetian military intervention began. The Doge at the time, exploiting internal strife and the chronic inability of the distant Byzantine theme administrators to enforce their authority, launched a major naval campaign. This action was justified under the pretense of restoring order and protecting existing Venetian commercial interests, but the ultimate goal was the effective annexation of key port infrastructure and the imposition of a permanent protectorate. The campaign resulted in the capture of several strategic islands and the capitulation of the most important walled cities, which recognized the Doge as their protector and renewed earlier tributes owed to the Republic, formally shifting their fealty away from the Croatian crown. Krešimir III was structurally disadvantaged in confronting this naval reality. His military power, centered on the land-based feudal nobility and the interior garrisons, lacked the specialized, high-capacity naval forces required for sustained open-sea warfare against the advanced Venetian fleet. Consequently, military engagement often consisted of limited, punitive actions in the immediate coastal vicinity, or attempts to interdict trade and levy prohibitive tolls on Venetian shipping, rather than decisive, pitched naval battles. This tactical preference affirmed the fundamental disparity in military domains. The kingdom controlled the strategic depth and internal resources of the terra firma, while the Republic maintained overwhelming superiority in the fluid maritime theatre. The diplomatic response of the Croatian king was characterized by attempts to leverage the theoretical authority of the Byzantine emperor. By appealing to Constantinople, Krešimir III aimed to encourage substantial Byzantine naval intervention, which would naturally challenge Venetian hegemony and restore the necessary three-way balance of power. While the emperor occasionally dispatched governors or symbolic fleets to Dalmatia, providing moral recognition of the king's legal title and status, this support rarely translated into the massive, sustained military commitment necessary to permanently dislodge the powerful Venetian garrisons from the fortified coastal settlements. The political capital derived from these Byzantine ties was more symbolic than militarily actionable. The result was a fluctuating political arrangement where sovereignty was never absolute for any single power. Venice maintained strong garrisons and imposed legal privileges on its merchants within the Dalmatian cities, effectively treating them as semi-autonomous protectorates subject to its commercial interests. Conversely, Krešimir III and his successors maintained a parallel civil authority over the populace and actively promoted ecclesiastical ties in the interior, strategically linking the national church with the royal authority. This conflict established the foundational geopolitical pattern for centuries to follow: a Croatian state split between its core land-based power structure and a commercially vital, yet politically contested, coastal fringe that remained permanently exposed to the ambitions of the dominant Adriatic naval power. The struggle was defined by controlling customs revenues, strategic ports, and the legal jurisdiction over the urban populations. The coastal strip of Dalmatia maintained a distinct socio-legal framework inherited directly from late antiquity, creating an inherent constitutional friction with the emerging Slavic feudal monarchy of the interior. These maritime communes, specifically Split, Trogir, and Zadar, functioned as the essential commercial nexus for the entire Croatian state. The interior, controlled by the king's župani and military apparatus, relied entirely on these ports for the import of luxury goods, finished metal products, and salt, resources which were indispensable for the elite economy and military outfitting. Conversely, the dense urban centres depended equally on the hinterland for the sustenance of their populations, relying on the predictable supply of raw materials, primarily cattle, grains, and lumber, which guaranteed the stability of their local markets. This pervasive, symbiotic economic dependence underpinned their frequently antagonistic political relationship. The urban elite comprised a self-perpetuating aristocracy that spoke and wrote Latin, governed by meticulously preserved communal statutes, and maintaining a sophisticated mercantile culture derived from centuries of Mediterranean trade. This stood in stark opposition to the Slavic nobility, whose political power was defined by control over territorial holdings and military service, operating under Germanic Slavic customary law and speaking the vernacular. This language and legal dichotomy represented a deep-seated cultural opposition between the urban Latinate civs and the land-based Slavic plemenity. Croatian monarchs, while respecting the city's formal internal autonomy, their rights to elect a rector and govern their own judicial affairs, employed specific strategies to assert sovereign authority and extract necessary resources. The crown exercised direct control over the vital customs regime, dictating tolls and tariffs on goods moving in and out of the fortified port gates. Furthermore, kings strategically granted loyal Slavic nobility landholdings, contado, immediately adjacent to the city's own agricultural territories, deliberately placing politically reliable subjects in positions of territorial leverage against the independent-minded urban councils. The royal authorities' right to quarter troops, demand compulsory market fees, and receive military contingents in times of war constituted the fundamental terms of the city's subordinate legal status. Documents from the 10th and 11th centuries reveal these obligations were regularly enforced, converting the city's economic vitality into a critical source of royal revenue and political legitimacy. The resulting tension was a constitutional struggle between the fiercely protected urban collective right and the centralizing power of the consolidating territorial monarch, a dynamic essential to the maintenance of the Croatian state's fiscal and defensive capabilities. The reign of Peter Krešimir IV, commencing around 1058 CE, marked the highest political and geographical reach of the medieval Croatian state under the native Trpimirović dynasty. Unlike his predecessors, Krešimir IV inherited a kingdom relatively free from immediate external military threats, allowing him to focus comprehensively on domestic consolidation and ambitious territorial expansion. His primary strategic objective was the full incorporation of the independent Romanized Dalmatian cities into the royal administration, thereby neutralizing the long-standing geopolitical friction between the coastal urban centers and the Slavic hinterland. This process was not achieved through outright conquest, but rather by astute political and economic maneuvers that recognized the distinct municipal rights of the cities while placing them under direct royal authority. To establish control over the vital coastal ports, Krešimir utilized the church, specifically leveraging his relationship with the papacy, which was keenly interested in enforcing liturgical reforms and Latinate ecclesiastical structure throughout the Adriatic. The synods of Split in 1060 CE served as a crucial instrument of this policy, formally prohibiting the Slavic liturgy and the use of the Glagolitic script in the church, while strengthening the organizational framework of the Latin dioceses centered in the cities. By actively supporting the papal agenda against the competing Eastern ecclesiastical influences, Krešimir gained papal recognition and validation, which bolstered his internal legitimacy and provided the necessary diplomatic cover to intervene directly in urban affairs. In return for political fealty and acceptance of the Latin hierarchy, the king consistently confirmed the ancient communal privileges, fiscal rights, and legal autonomy, statuta, of the cities like Zadar, Split, and Trogir. Beyond securing the Dalmatian coast, Krešimir IV successfully incorporated the Byzantine theme of Dalmatia into his domain, an administrative territory previously held by Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, facing strategic crises elsewhere, especially with the rise of the Normans in southern Italy, was compelled to recognize Croatian de facto control over this territory in exchange for nominal homage. The inclusion of the Byzantine territory into the Croatian realm was a landmark achievement, cementing his authority over nearly the entire geographical unit of Dalmatia. To reflect this expanded and integrated dominion, the king formally adopted the magnificent title Rex Croati et Dalmati, King of the Croats and Dalmatians. This title was not merely ceremonial, it served as a precise legal assertion that his royal mandate extended over both the inland Slavic nobility, Croatia, and the highly prized, predominantly Latin urban centres, Dalmatia, unifying these traditionally separate political spheres under a single sovereign. Krešimir IV further expanded the kingdom's reach by asserting overlordship over the Principality of Slavonia, the region between the Drava and Sava rivers previously known as the Duchy of Pannonia. While the precise nature of control fluctuated, royal charters confirm his influence, thereby completing the geographical foundation of the medieval Croatian state, stretching from the Drava to the Adriatic. He actively promoted the settlement of the interior, founding the city of Šibenik, the only major city on the Adriatic coast that traces its foundation directly to a native Croatian ruler, symbolizing the culmination of a political process that had successfully merged inland political power with coastal maritime influence. The entire reign was characterized by the king's centralized control, political pragmatism, and his strategic use of ecclesiastical and feudal authority to establish what later sources would often describe as a golden age of stability and prosperity before the subsequent dynastic turbulence. The maturation of the Croatian state during the 11th century required the evolution of its internal governance, transitioning from a loose confederation of tribal military leaders to a structured institutional monarchy. This administrative framework was defined by the systematic adaptation of European feudal practices, synthesized with pre-existing Slavic political customs. Unlike the centralized feudal models of Western Europe, the Croatian system maintained a delicate balance where the monarch's authority relied not just on land tenure, but on the fealty of a deeply entrenched native nobility. The kingdom's political organization formally rested upon the relationship between the sovereign, the magnates, and the developing institution of the ban. The office of the ban represented the highest administrative, military, and judicial authority reporting directly to the king. The ban was fundamentally the king's viceroy, governing large, often volatile, border provinces. Initially, a single ban administered the entire realm, but as the kingdom grew in complexity and territorial scope, especially with the addition of Slavonia and portions of Dalmatia, the office became subdivided, creating multiple bans with specific regional jurisdictions. These individuals were drawn from the most powerful and trusted noble families, giving them immense prestige and resources, including the exclusive right to mint subsidiary coinage in their territory. The ban presided over his own court, commanding the local military levy, exercitus, and acting as the final appellate judge in his assigned region, making him the effective ruler of his province, second only to the monarch. Below the ban and the king stood the local nobility, župani, and later nezovi, whose power structures remained remarkably resilient. The župani were hereditary heads of tribal territorial units, županije, responsible for collecting taxes, organizing local defense, and presiding over lower courts. As the monarchy centralized, the king gradually transformed these formerly independent tribal leaders into salaried royal officials, cementing their loyalty through grants of land and title. The nobles' increasing wealth, derived from exploiting both their own domain land and collecting royal taxes and tolls, provided them with the ability to raise and equip significant private retinues, which constituted the core of the kingdom's military strength. The aristocracy's growing power was formally counterbalanced by the king's prerogative to convene the Sabor assembly or diet, a non-permanent consultative body. While the nature and composition of this early assembly remained debated whether it represented all free men or only the higher nobility, its function was to affirm succession, endorse significant royal decrees, and agree to war levies. The king's ability to summon and control the Sabor was essential for legislative legitimacy and managing aristocratic consent. However, this decentralized political landscape, characterized by powerful regional bands and deeply rooted noble families, carried an intrinsic structural weakness. The kingdom's cohesion was intensely reliant on the strength and charismatic authority of the reigning monarch. Following the rule of a strong central figure, the entrenched regional powers could, and often would, exploit any dynastic crisis or weakness in succession to assert greater autonomy, paving the way for eventual external intervention. The spiritual and intellectual development of the medieval Croatian kingdom was inextricably linked to the influence of European monasticism, specifically the Benedictine order. These monastic foundations, primarily established through royal and aristocratic patronage, served not only as centers of piety, but as crucial conduits for Western European political and cultural influence, solidifying Croatia's adherence to the Roman spiritual sphere. The Benedictine movement, focused on the principles of stabilitas loci, work, and prayer, provided the organizational structure necessary for the establishment of literacy, record-keeping, and the development of sophisticated religious art. During the 10th and 11th centuries, the establishment of monasteries like those at Beograd, Trogir, and the celebrated street Kruševan in Zadar was a direct political act by the Trpimirović monarchs. These kings provided endowments of land and jurisdiction, immunitas, to the abbeys, thereby creating dependable royal support networks separate from the often fractious secular nobility. In return, the monasteries offered spiritual legitimacy through constant prayer for the royal house and provided highly educated clerics who staffed the king's chancery, creating the necessary administrative capacity for a centralized state. The monks served as archivists and scribes, producing and preserving vital state documents, charters, and royal chronicles, many of which form the primary historical sources available today. The relationship between the monasteries and the monarchy accelerated the assimilation of Romanesque artistic and architectural styles. The building of new churches and monastic complexes introduced sophisticated stoneworking and sculptural techniques previously unknown in the hinterland. These structures, often modelled after Italian Romanesque basilicas, physically manifested the kingdom's cultural alignment with the West, transforming the aesthetic landscape of the coast and parts of the interior. The Benedictine presence facilitated the introduction of musical notation, plainchant, and the proper observance of the Latin liturgy, integrating the Croatian church into the wider European ecclesiastical community. However, this Latinate influence did not erase Slavic cultural identity. The Benedictine movement inadvertently played a dual role, fostering not only Latin literacy, but also preserving and promoting the unique glagolitic script and the Slavic vernacular in the liturgy, especially in the more isolated northern and island dioceses. These Slavic Benedictine houses maintained the use of the Old Church Slavonic language, adapting the Latin liturgical books into glagolitic script, creating a distinctive glagolitic Latin biculturalism. Royal patronage often extended to these Slavic Rite monasteries, demonstrating the monarchy's deliberate policy of balancing integration with the papacy against the need to affirm native identity and appease powerful local interests who preferred the Slavic tongue in their worship. This strategic patronage ensured that while the Latin script and tongue dominated royal courts and trade, the glagolitic tradition endured as a powerful marker of cultural and linguistic uniqueness within the kingdom. The reign of Dimitar Zvonimir, who ascended to the Croatian throne in 1075 CE, represented the zenith of the kingdom's integration into the hierarchical structure of Western Europe. His acquisition of the throne was initially facilitated by his strong familial connections to the Hungarian royal house, and crucially, by his preceding tenure as Ban of Slavonia, a position which granted him military authority over the northern provinces. His strategic objective was to secure absolute recognition from the Roman Curia under Pope Gregory VII, the most powerful political and spiritual arbiter of the time, thereby ensuring the unquestionable legitimacy of his rule against both domestic challengers and the lingering geopolitical claims of the Byzantine Empire. The most defining event of his rule was the coronation ceremony, held in 1,075 inches the Basilica of St. Peter and Moses in Solin. This act was orchestrated with precise diplomatic choreography. Zvonimir did not simply assume the crown, he received it directly from the hands of the Pope's official legate Gebizon, who delivered the royal diadem, scepter, and banner from Rome. This was a monumental concession by the papacy, acknowledging the king's sovereignty through a direct transfer of symbolic authority. The official document accompanying the ceremony stipulated that the king was formally receiving the kingdom from St. Peter, effectively positioning Zvonimir as a feudal vassal of the Holy See. This arrangement, while seemingly diminishing the king's independence on paper, secured papal protection and recognition, far outweighing the cost of nominal feudal subordination. The coronation was contingent upon Zvonimir making a public, formal vow to reform the state according to canonical law and papal mandates. These obligations were not merely spiritual, they were a binding political contract with international legal implications. The king vowed to uphold justice, protect the church's property and rights of clergy, and enforce the suppression of simony and concubinage among the local ecclesiastical structure. More significantly, he pledged military allegiance to the papacy, obligating him to provide armed forces to support the Pope's causes when called upon. This military commitment, a form of service known as auxilium, was a tangible sign of the kingdom's integration into the Western European sphere, transforming Croatia's military capacity into a resource for broader papal policy. The formalization of the kingdom's status profoundly altered its international standing. Zvonimir's immediate diplomatic actions reflected this new position. He successfully leveraged the papal alliance to solidify his control over the Dalmatian cities, which were heavily influenced by the papacy and Venice. Furthermore, he strategically married Jelena, Helen, the Beautiful, a princess of the Arpad dynasty, thereby securing a critical dynastic link to the ruling house of Hungary that would shape the course of Croatian history for centuries to come. His use of the title King Dimitar, explicitly naming himself after the popular Byzantine saint Demetrius, alongside the use of the seal bearing his image in royal regalia, demonstrates his skillful navigation of the cultural and political divide, asserting his royal power to both the Latin West and the traditionally Byzantine-influenced east of his domain. His brief but powerful reign definitively anchored the Croatian state within the Western Catholic and feudal world, establishing precedents for royal legitimacy that would be invoked long after the Trpimirović line came to its end. The formal coronation of King Dimitar Zvonimir in 1075 CE was bound by a rigorous contractual agreement with the papacy, defined by the king's public vow and the subsequent military obligations. These mandates were not suggestions for reform but direct, enforceable requirements that formalized the kingdom's role within the broader European political and ecclesiastical hierarchy. The reforms Zvonimir vowed to implement were designed to bring the local Slavic church into full compliance with the ongoing Gregorian reforms sweeping the Latin West. Specifically, the king pledged his secular authority to assist the papal legate, Gebizon, in rooting out the entrenched practices of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and Nicolaism, the marriage or concubinage of the clergy, which had become widespread in the Dalmatian and Croatian interior. Beyond these internal ecclesiastical issues, Zvonimir's most tangible and internationally significant obligation was the provision of military and naval support to the papacy and its allies. This pledge was more than symbolic. It was an act of foreign policy that directly opposed the Byzantine Empire. The key conflict at the time centered on the control of southern Italy and the Adriatic Sea, where the rising power of the Normans under Robert Guiscard operating with papal sanction, was vigorously challenging long-standing Byzantine dominance. Zvonimir was compelled by his feudal oath to assist the Normans, providing them with naval resources to confront the Byzantines across the Strait of Otranto. This involvement was critical because the fledgling Croatian state, possessing a strong, albeit localized, naval tradition, effectively provided an Adriatic front for the anti-Byzantine coalition. The Croatian fleet's primary role was to transport Norman troops and equipment across the Adriatic and, crucially, to disrupt Byzantine logistical and maritime communication lines between Constantinople and their remaining holdings in the Balkans and southern Italy. The deployment of Croatian vessels directly assisted the Norman campaigns, which included the siege of Durazzo, a major Byzantine outpost. This demonstrated that the newly crowned kingdom was prepared to commit significant resources, specifically its naval power, to its feudal patron, the Pope, even at the cost of direct confrontation with the Eastern Emperor. The financial component of Zvonimir's pledge further underscored his vassalage. He committed to paying a regular annual census tribute to the papal curia, an economic commitment that validated the feudal relationship. This payment secured the kingdom's status as a protected entity under the mantle of St. Peter. However, the military expenditure required to maintain a fleet capable of supporting distant campaigns in the southern Adriatic put significant strain on the kingdom's nascent royal treasury, which largely depended on tolls, market revenues, and tribute from the cities. The ultimate outcome of this policy was the elevation of Croatia's diplomatic profile, transforming it from a peripheral Frankish Byzantine border state into an acknowledged, albeit subordinate, member of the European Catholic military alliance structure, securing its position against the Byzantine and Venetian counterclaims. The Zvonimir stone, formerly known as the Bashka tablet, Bashchanska plocha, represents one of the most significant epigraphic monuments for understanding the linguistic and institutional history of the Croatian state. Discovered in 1,851 inches the pavement of the Church of Street, Lucy near Bashka on the island of Krk, the stone fragment contains a lengthy, meticulously carved inscription detailing a royal land donation. This artifact provides concrete evidence of royal jurisdiction and the unique cultural landscape of the 11th century. The tablet's contents record that King Zvonimir donated a tract of land to the Benedictine monastery of St. Lucy, documenting the boundaries of the property and listing witnesses and officials involved in the transaction. The primary importance of the tablet is its sophisticated use of the Glagolitic script. Glagolitic, an ancient Slavic alphabet believed to have been devised by St. Cyril in the 9th century, is employed here in its distinct angular Croatian variant. The script is not merely present, but is used to render the vernacular Old Church Slavonic language, providing a crucial snapshot of the evolving Slavic lexicon at a key moment of state consolidation. The Glagolitic letters are physically integrated into a stone surface that typically would have been reserved for Latin, the official language of the Roman Church, and the royal chancery underscoring a deliberate assertion of native linguistic identity within a formal, legal, and ecclesiastical context. This integration of scripts and languages showcases the trilingual and multicultural nature of the Croatian state during its zenith. The inscription's opening lines, while executed in Glagolitic, follow the established diplomatic protocol and formal salutations common to Latin royal charters across Europe. Furthermore, the stone employs Latin, Glagolitic, and sometimes even Cyrillic scripts across various surviving documents of the era, reflecting the three coexisting spheres of influence. Latin, the language of the papacy, the Dalmatian cities, and high administration. Glagolitic, divided by Old Church Slavonic, the language of the local liturgy and early native literacy. And Cyrillic, used predominantly in parts of the southern hinterland and the eastern Balkans. This pluralism necessitated a unique administrative flexibility among the monastic scribes and royal clerks. The Zvonimir stone specifically names the reigning monarch, King Zvonimir, Kralj H. Hrvatskij, and mentions the Benedictine abbot, Družiha, who oversaw the donation. The precise detail of the land demarcation recorded on the tablet served a crucial legal function, preventing future disputes over ownership between the secular nobility and the monastic community. The stone's existence proves that glagolitic was not restricted to informal religious use, but had attained the necessary gravitas to be deployed for permanent, legally binding documentation of property rights. This legacy of glagolitic literacy, nurtured primarily within isolated Benedictine monastic scriptoria, ensured the survival of a distinct Croatian literary tradition for centuries, even when political circumstances favoured the complete dominance of Latin and, later, Italian in the coastal regions. The reign of Dimitar Zvonimir, which had elevated the Croatian kingdom to a new echelon of European influence, concluded abruptly and mysteriously around 1089 CE, initiating a period of terminal dynastic decline. The precise circumstances surrounding his passing remain one of the most vigorously debated and historically clouded episodes in the entire medieval period, transforming the event into a crucial succession crisis. The most widely circulated narrative, derived from later ecclesiastical chronicles, posits that the king was assassinated by his own high nobility. This tradition suggests the magnates resented Zvonimir's close alignment with the papacy, and, specifically, his decision to raise a large military levy to support the papal Norman war effort in the Levant, an engagement deemed disruptive and burdensome by the powerful local aristocracy. Other, more sober historical interpretations dispute the sensationalism of assassination, suggesting that Zvonimir likely succumbed to a sudden natural illness or was killed in a localized skirmish, perhaps a consequence of the rising internal instability caused by the very reforms he was attempting to enforce. Regardless of the exact cause, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The king died without leaving a direct male heir to the throne. His only known son, Radovan, had likely predeceased him, thus extinguishing the senior line of the native Trpimirovic dynasty after more than 2 centuries of rule. The immediate political vacuum was profound, dismantling the centralized administrative power that Zvonimir had only recently cemented through his papal coronation. The kingdom, built on the intricate feudal loyalty of powerful local magnates, suddenly lacked the charismatic authority necessary to command adherents. The inherent structural weakness of the medieval Croatian political system, its intense reliance on the personal strength of the sovereign rather than codified law, became instantly apparent. The high nobility, sensing an opportunity to reclaim lost prerogatives and dilute royal authority, immediately divided into competing factions. These local power struggles quickly escalated into a civil conflict, creating widespread instability. To prevent total collapse, the surviving Croatian nobility managed to elevate Stephen II to the throne, a member of a peripheral Trpimirovic cadet branch. Stephen II's reign was brief and largely ineffectual, acting as a mere interregnum. The surviving charters from his short tenure reveal an attempt to re-establish legitimacy, but simultaneously confirm the increasing autonomy of the regional magnates and the bands, who began to operate as independent rulers. When Stephen II died, likely in 1091 CE, the ancient Trpimirovic royal house was formally extinct. The collapse of the native dynasty provided the pretext for the ambitious neighbouring power to intervene, exploiting the resulting power vacuum. Zvonimir's widow, Jelena Helen, the sister of the then-reigning Ladislas I of Hungary, became the key political link. The Hungarian crown, based on this dynastic claim, immediately asserted its right to the vacant Croatian throne, setting the stage for the definitive foreign intervention that would fundamentally reshape the kingdom's sovereignty. The brief reign of Stephen II, which began in the aftermath of Dimitar Zvonimir's mysterious death around 1089 CE, represents the poignant and final chapter of the Trpimirovic dynasty. Stephen II, the last surviving male of a royal cadet line, inherited a kingdom already fragmented by civil unrest and lacking a clear line of succession. His ascent to the throne was less an exercise in powerful monarchical succession and more a desperate political necessity orchestrated by the remaining loyalist nobility to temporarily stabilize the state. His rule lasted only 2 years, and historical records from this period are remarkably sparse, underscoring the political marginalization the central court experienced. The primary characteristic of his short tenure was its ineffectiveness against the growing autonomy of the regional magnates and the nascent civil war. Stephen II lacked the political capital and military prestige necessary to enforce the centralized mandates that his powerful predecessors, like Krešimir IV and Zvonimir, had commanded. The documents surviving from his court, mostly monastic charters, show a king attempting to confirm previous grants and privileges rather than initiating new policy or asserting territorial claims. This reliance on confirmation highlights his weakness. He was dependent on the goodwill of the powerful ecclesiastical and secular nobility to acknowledge his nominal authority. The true significance of Stephen II's reign is symbolic, marking a critical transition point from native sovereignty to foreign dynastic claim. His death, which occurred peacefully around 1091 CE, formally extinguished the royal house that had ruled the Croats for over 2 centuries. The moment of his passing created an unprecedented legal and political vacuum. There was no internal mechanism, either through designated male heir or established constitutional law, to pass the crown to a legitimate, recognized Croatian noble. This dynastic failure immediately converted internal instability into an opportunity for external intervention. The immediate consequence of the extinction was the acceleration of internal conflict. The most powerful noble families, including the Kachichi and the Nelepichi, openly contested authority, effectively governing their respective territories as sovereign entities while vying for control of the defunct central court. This decentralized warfare severely weakened the kingdom's borders and military readiness. This vacuum was strategically exploited by the Hungarian crown, whose claim was rooted in the direct familial link established by the marriage of the late King Zvonimir to Jelena, Helen, the Beautiful, sister of the Hungarian king Ladislaus I. Ladislaus immediately advanced his claim, asserting that the extinction of the native line entitled him to inherit the now vacant Croatian throne. This move initiated the first major Hungarian invasion and cemented the transition of Croatia from a politically fragmented sovereign entity to a hotly contested prize, setting the stage for the definitive end of its independent medieval history. The passing of the last Trpimirovich king, Stephen II, in 1091 CE immediately activated the strategic interests of the neighbouring Hungarian crown, setting the stage for direct foreign intervention. The key figure enabling this claim was Jelena, Helen, the Beautiful, the widowed queen of the late King Dimitar Zvonimir. Jelena was a member of the powerful Arpad dynasty, sister to the reigning Hungarian king Ladislaus I. This established dynastic link provided the essential legal pretext for Ladislaus to assert a claim over the now vacant Croatian throne, arguing that the extinction of the native male line entitled him to inherit the crown through his sister's lineage. The internal political vacuum in Croatia, characterized by endemic civil conflict among the noble factions, offered the perfect opportunity for the Hungarian intervention. Ladislaus I initiated the first major Hungarian military incursion into the Croatian heartland in 1091 CE. The objective was clear: to secure the northern provinces and impose his authority as the legitimate successor. The Hungarian forces met little organized resistance from the fractured Croatian magnates, who were preoccupied with fighting each other. Ladislaus's initial campaign was highly successful, securing all the territory north of the Gvozd mountain. This military success had profound and lasting administrative consequences, most notably the establishment of the Diocese of Zagreb. Prior to the Hungarian arrival, the ecclesiastical organization of northern Croatia, Slavonia, was fragmented. Ladislaus I founded the new Zagreb bishopric as a strategic move to solidify Hungarian control over the newly acquired territory. By establishing a centralized Latin Rite ecclesiastical authority linked directly to the Hungarian structure, he created an administrative anchor that would persist for centuries. The foundation charter of the diocese, which secured its property and privileges, ensured that Hungarian influence was embedded not only militarily, but also spiritually and administratively within the heart of Slavonia. While the initial Hungarian military campaign secured the northern region, it did not immediately result in the full conquest of the whole Croatian kingdom. The coastal and southern regions, where the most powerful native nobility remained entrenched, maintained a fierce resistance, pushing the conflict into a prolonged civil war. This resistance, centralized around the efforts to elect a native noble as king, temporarily stalled the full imposition of Hungarian authority. Ladislaus, unable to decisively conquer the entire kingdom, entrusted the governance of the newly captured northern territories to his nephew Almos, who ruled as a prince. This action created a semi-independent administrative unit, separate from the core Hungarian kingdom but firmly under Arpad dynastic control. The Hungarian intervention effectively carved the historic Croatian territory into two distinct zones: the northern zone under immediate Arpad control and the southern, coastal zone, still governed by fragmented native factions fighting to prevent complete subjugation. The direct claim and swift action by Ladislaus I, facilitated by the dynastic connection to Zvonimir's widow, permanently ended Croatia's period of unbroken native sovereignty. Following the initial Hungarian incursion in 1091 CE and the subsequent death of King Ladislaus I, the remaining Croatian high nobility took decisive action to reassert their sovereignty. Rejecting the Arpad claim and the presence of Hungarian administration in Slavonia, a faction of the southern magnates convened to elect a native monarch. This concerted effort led to the elevation of Peter Svacic, a respected noble, to the Croatian throne around 1093 CE. His coronation, the exact details of which are undocumented but certainly occurred in the traditional centers of Dalmatian power, represented the last unified attempt by the Croatian aristocracy to govern the kingdom autonomously, free from external dynastic control. Svacic successfully established a fragile but functioning royal court, commanding the fealty of the principal noble houses of the coastal and southern interior regions who fiercely opposed the foreign presence. The election of Svacic immediately intensified the military confrontation with the Hungarians. The internal struggle for the Croatian crown became an international war for territorial control. By this point, the Hungarian throne had passed to Koloman, Ladislaus's nephew, an astute ruler determined to complete his predecessor's objective of fully incorporating the Croatian kingdom. Koloman viewed Svacic's coronation as an act of open defiance against the established dynastic claims and prepared a large-scale campaign to decisively crush the southern resistance. The strategic focus of the conflict centered on Gvozd Mountain, a critical geographical barrier that separated the already Hungarian-controlled Pannonian region, Slavonia, from the remaining independent Dalmatian heartland. Control of this mountain pass was essential for projecting military power into the core of Dalmatia. King Peter Svacic, recognizing the strategic importance of the location, positioned his assembled forces, a coalition of loyalists drawn from the southern Jupanije and regional lordships at the mountain's southern approaches. The resulting engagement, known to history as the Battle of Gvozd Mountain, occurred in 1097 CE. The battle was a definitive military encounter fought between Koloman's professional Hungarian army and the Croatian levy assembled under their last native king. The specifics of the deployment are obscured by the lack of contemporary military records, but the outcome was conclusive. The superior organization and tactical depth of the Hungarian forces proved overwhelming against the regional Croatian levies, which were likely composed of less cohesive noble retinues. The battle concluded with the total defeat of the Croatian forces and the death of King Peter Svacic on the battlefield. His demise was not merely a military loss, but a devastating political and symbolic conclusion. With Svacic's fall, the last vestige of native royal power was extinguished. The Croatian nobility, though resilient and persistent, had been decisively defeated by a consolidated foreign power. The mountain where the king fell was subsequently renamed Petrova Gora, Peter's Mountain, in honor of the final resistance. This decisive Hungarian victory removed the last major military obstacle to the full territorial acquisition of the Croatian kingdom, paving the way for Koloman's final diplomatic and political actions to formalize the union of the crowns. The subsequent integration would proceed through negotiation rather than continued expensive military conflict, but the defeat at Petrova Gora sealed the fate of the independent medieval Croatian state. The military defeat of the final organized resistance at Petrova Gora in 1097 CE effectively removed the last major obstacle to Hungarian control. Following this conclusive victory, King Kaloman of Hungary, recognizing the formidable political resilience and deeply entrenched power of the Croatian aristocracy, shifted his strategy from costly, prolonged military conquest to pragmatic diplomatic negotiation. This astute change in approach aimed to secure the full political acquisition of the Croatian realm, while simultaneously neutralizing internal dissent by granting necessary constitutional concessions to the powerful native magnates. This political resolution was formalized around 1102 CE through an agreement between the king and representatives of the Croatian nobility. This seminal pact established the personal union between the two realms. Although the later document, known as the Pacta Conventa, often cited as the charter of this union, is considered by many historians to be a reconstruction from the 14th century, its core tenets accurately reflect the political reality of the arrangement. That the two kingdoms would share a common sovereign, but retain separate legal and administrative identities. Croatia was not absorbed as a mere province. It remained a distinct political entity ruled in persona regis. To legitimize this union, King Koloman traveled south for a formal ceremony. His coronation as King of Croatia and Dalmatia, which likely took place in the coastal city of Beograd, was a necessary legal and ceremonial step. By accepting the Croatian crown, Koloman committed himself to upholding the specific laws, customs, and privileges of the Croatian nobility and people, acknowledging the kingdom's continued institutional existence. This act was essential for securing the formal fealty of the remaining powerful southern lords, who otherwise would have continued their resistance. The negotiations guaranteed fundamental administrative autonomy for Croatia. Crucially, the supreme executive and military authority within the kingdom remained vested in the indigenous office of the Ban, viceroy, who governed the territory directly on behalf of the common monarch. Furthermore, the nobility successfully secured the promise that the entire Croatian realm would maintain its own separate legal system and judicial framework. Royal charters explicitly protected the aristocracy from having to pay taxes to the Hungarian crown, except when directly required for the defense of the region, ensuring that the local magnates retained their substantial economic prerogatives. The establishment of this personal union marked the definitive end of the native dynasty's sovereignty. However, the constitutional framework provided a critical legal shield. The kingdom retained its territorial integrity, its own high officials, and its own legislative identity. This preserved legal continuity served as the indispensable bedrock of Croatian statehood throughout the remainder of the medieval period, ensuring that the political union was based on a pact between two kingdoms rather than subjugation by one. The formal establishment of the personal union in 1102 CE, while placing the Hungarian monarch at the head of the Croatian state, necessitated the creation of institutional mechanisms to preserve Croatian political autonomy. The most crucial of these mechanisms was the continuation and elevation of the indigenous office of the Ban, viceroy. This role was fundamental to the maintenance of Croatian statehood within the composite monarchy, serving as the sovereign's highest administrative and military representative within the separate kingdom. The Ban's authority was not derived from a Hungarian feudal title, but was a direct continuation of the ancient native constitutional tradition, underscoring the legal distinctiveness of the Croatian realm. The Ban was the effective head of government, wielding supreme judicial, executive, and military power. Judicially, the Ban presided over the highest court of appeal, acting as the final arbiter of justice for all subjects outside the royal court itself. This ensured that the separate Croatian legal system, a blend of native customary law and Roman precedents remained in force, with final judgments rendered by a local official rather than being outsourced to the Hungarian judicial structure. This judicial independence was vital to preserving the kingdom's legal identity. Administratively, the Ban managed the royal domains, collected revenues from tolls and market fees, and supervised the powerful county heads, župani. The Ban served as the king's seal in all internal matters, authenticating official charters and decrees that governed the lives of both the nobility and the commoners. This concentration of executive functions in the hands of a single non-royal official provided the operational continuity that the kingdom required, given that the king himself was often resident in Buda or Esztergom. The Ban was literally the face of royal authority in the Adriatic realm. Militarily, the Ban was the commander-in-chief of the entire Croatian levy, responsible for border defense and suppressing internal rebellions. This military power was essential, particularly in the south, where conflicts with the Republic of Venice were recurrent. The Ban organized and led the exercitus, noble levy, mobilizing the forces provided by the regional magnates and commanding garrisons in the key fortified strongholds. The integrity of the Dalmatian-Croatian border with the Venetian, Byzantine, and later Ottoman spheres depended entirely on the Ban's capacity for rapid and decisive military action. The political role of the Ban often extended beyond simple administrative function. As the highest non-royal official, the Ban held the authority to convene the Sabor parliamentary diet, which provided the essential aristocratic consent required for major legislation or taxation. This made the Ban the crucial intermediary between the absentee monarch and the powerful native aristocracy, ensuring that any royal policy was filtered through the lens of Croatian noble interest. The Ban's appointment, typically drawn from the most influential Hungarian or sometimes Croatian noble families, reflected the reigning monarch's attempt to balance loyalty to the crown with the necessity of acknowledging local political power structures, a constant negotiation that defined the political life of the kingdom under the personal union. The persistence and power of the Ban's office over subsequent centuries served as the most tangible and continuous evidence that Croatia was a self-governing entity bound only in persona to the Hungarian crown.